Welcome to the China Desk Podcast, presented by the Federal Newswire, with your host, Steve Yates.
Welcome to the China Desk Podcast, Episode 12. I'm your host, Steve Yates, Senior Fellow at the America First Policy Institute and Chair of the China Policy Initiative. A reminder to our audience, for whom we are most grateful. Viewers can watch the China Desk on YouTube or subscribe to hear all our interviews on Apple, Google, Spotify, and most other podcast providers. You can always access our podcasts at thefederalnewswire.com. My guest today is Bill Drexel. Bill is an Associate Fellow for the Technology and National Security Program at the Center for a New American Security. His research focuses on tech competition, specifically on the risks of artificial intelligence in national defense. He has conducted investigative research in Xinjiang and has previously worked as an internal displacement data officer at UN Migration and as a research associate at the American Enterprise Institute. At AEI, Bill focused on tech competition and Indo-Pacific strategy. Bill, welcome to the China Desk. Let's jump in.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Thank you. Well, as we jump into a broad topic of AI and potential problems with that in China, the place it should take in U.S.-China relations and policy, can you do a little bit of a deeper dive on your background on how you went from, I assume, growing up in everyday America and studying things, policy or history or whatever, and then ending up going to Xinjiang and studying things that have to do with artificial intelligence?
Sure. Well, you're right. I grew up in Houston, Texas. Nothing particularly AI-centric about my upbringing. In college, I started to look more into international affairs, and I actually really focused on South Asia and only went to China for a comparative perspective. But while I was there, I kind of stumbled into this Xinjiang dystopia, and it was just one of the most chilling experiences of my life. Since then, I've really focused on how artificial intelligence can reshape our world in a lot of ways that could be really nefarious, and how the Chinese Communist Party is really driving that train in a very dark direction.
Well, before we get into some of the policy and kind of current challenges that we have today and that you've written copiously about, I want to jump a little bit more into just the Xinjiang experience. In our pre-show, we're talking a little bit about that not very many Americans wake up saying the syllables Xinjiang or Uyghur, and probably if we polled a random sampling of Americans going up and down any busy street, we'd be hard-pressed to find people who could point on a map where this was and what we're talking about. So can you talk a little bit about where you went and kind of what the key observations or takeaways were, balanced against what your expectations were? What matched with those expectations, and what took you in a completely different direction? Any of those things, fair game.
Sure. So I went to Xinjiang at really, I think, an opportune time. This was just a few months into the Uyghur repression story really hitting the mainstream news. So this was beginning of October 2018. I've had friends who went subsequently and who had a much more difficult time getting an kind of unmediated view of the area. I went basically as a tourist. I had been studying Chinese state surveillance of especially urban Protestants in maybe urban China. And seeing all this news starting to come out about the Uyghurs and Xinjiang, I thought, if I have the opportunity, I better go and just get a glimpse of it. So we stopped in just a handful, Urumqi, which is the capital, and a couple other kind of tourist route destinations. The main place we stayed was Kashgar, which is where I learned the most. It's kind of the cultural center of kind of the Uyghur homeland. And it's also seen some of the most dramatic uh, surveillance state apparatus because of its cultural heritage, and also because the whole city's been raised and rebuilt, optimized for this sort of technological repression.
Well, can you talk a little bit about, I guess there's two challenges here that we're going to grapple with. One is just surveillance and technology's application there. Really coming up through the 1990s, we were all celebrating and borderline indoctrinated into the liberating powers of the internet. Packet switching technology was going to be the final frontier of free speech and freedom, and authoritarian governments were going to cower and perhaps crumble in the face of these kinds of new liberating technologies. And yet, 20 to 30 years later, we are seeing a lot of these same kinds of technologies being used as tools for surveillance, control, and repression, not free speech and liberation. So I guess on sort of the first down payment on our conversation, talk a little bit about the surveillance part before we get to AI. And Xinjiang as kind of a laboratory for this kind of modern technology being used for purposes that are directly opposite of what the post-Cold War dividend was supposed to be. And what were some of the special qualities about Xinjiang and the People's Republic that made this a particularly poignant lesson for you to observe?
Sure. Well, I think the part of it is that the repression in Xinjiang goes back further than this sort of technologically based surveillance boom. So there was a lot of surveillance really since Xinjiang was absorbed into the PRC. And that was another kind of amazing thing about my research. I ended up interviewing a lot of people from Kashgar originally who left in the early 2000s or the late 2000s, who spoke a lot about how they endured quite a lot of surveillance without kind of high-tech mechanisms. The technology that's now matured, and that the United States in large part really helped mature in China, has just turbocharged pre-existing trends. And so whereas before you had a kind of a culture of different ways of making citizens report on each other, family members report on each other, keep tabs on each other, now you've got a kind of more and more automated system where they're able to link that kind of more analog human system together with facial recognition, with voice recognition, with gait recognition, with all of these tools that they're able to leverage to kind of control.
And what is it about Xinjiang that made it a particularly fruitful field for the Chinese Communist Party to develop and deploy, test these kinds of systems? Obviously, the Uyghurs are not the only sensitive, I say in air quotes, population within China. You made mention of Protestants in urban areas. Apparently, they're quite a threat to the CCP as well. But there seems to be kind of this kind of cordoned off laboratory quality to Xinjiang. So what do you see as kind of the inputs? Is it the geography? Is it the sort of delineation of a cultural divide where obviously this was not a traditional Chinese culture? This is a territory that was absorbed by force. That's happened around the world, but the current government wants to pretend as if this has always been a part of China when it clearly has not been. But what do you see as kind of the ingredients that made this development and deployment of these tools in that area particularly a useful laboratory for Beijing?
So I think it's a combination of a few factors. You mentioned a couple. One is that the Uyghurs are ethnically distinct from the majority Han Chinese. They're also kind of cordoned off in a far kind of western branch of what is now China. I think another element is that whereas Tibetans, for example, have the Dalai Lama who fled China and has acted as kind of an international advocate for their cause, there hasn't been that same level of visibility for the Uyghurs. So those two factors combined with kind of uh, their religious makeup being from an Islamic culture, the CCP was able to kind of paint this as a um, Islamic terrorism counter extremist effort. It's true that there have been some kind of terrorist events in Xinjiang that the CCP will point to as justifications for their crackdown. But in nature, if you look more closely at those events, they're much more to do with uh, kind of inter-ethnic tension and the Chinese state kind of trying to tame the region than they are about religion as such. I think it's that combination of separate ethnicity, kind of a far off land, and the ability to label it in terms of Islamic extremism erroneously that have given them the justification to really treat this as a petri dish for their uh, more extreme forms of authoritarian tech.
Well, all good points. I just think for audience perspective, when people think of, say, the United States as an example, yes, to go from East Coast to West Coast is a far distance. But when you have oceans on both sides that draw population centers to them, you sort of have a sense of balance or connection across the country. When you go from China's East Coast into its far west, you're going out into increasingly rural, low population areas, and it goes up into mountain passes, high altitude plateaus. And so it's as if you had a high plateau or mountain range bordering California instead of the Pacific Ocean. And so when people try to think about what is China, they often think of the East Coast of Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, or something like that. This is very, very different area and very far away and completely unknown and remote to almost all Chinese people, too. I mean, very few people in China would wake up and say, for my summer vacation, I'd like to go to Kashgar or Urumqi. It's just not on the list of to dos. So this is a very remote area. So even if you had Chinese people who were concerned, had a sense of ethics about this, and felt like they could stand up to the CCP, odds are 90+% of them are never going to find this part of their own country having anything to do with their everyday lives. And so it's a very detached area that gives kind of a degree of impunity to the government in doing stuff there. Let's jump into a little bit of the crossover into AI. So we've talked a bit about Xinjiang and the travesty of the genocide that's being conducted there. That's a whole conversation we could continue, but I would like to do a little bit of that as opportunities present. But I want to deal with the thesis of the foreign affairs article that you put forward recently. There are several really compelling ideas that are even just in the intro material. But let's talk first about the provocative kind of headliner. It says today's AI sprint would not be the first time Beijing's desire to hasten progress invited disaster. So give some context of, if this wouldn't be the first time, what was some of the earlier times, and how did earlier PRCs rush toward progress invite disaster?
Sure. Well, there are quite a few examples that stretch back really to the early days of the PRC right up to the present day. The biggest, the most obvious is the Great Leap Forward, where Mao Zedong, the leader of the Chinese state at that time, really was obsessed with passing up the Western world in industrialization and steel production, and pushed the population to collectivize farms, melt down farming equipment, and do this kind of sprint to produce steel. And the upshot was actually the worst famine in human history, with an estimated 33 million individuals starving to death. There are a few other examples worth noting. I mean, in the more present day, I would point to especially the Belt and Road Initiative. There's been some great investigative reporting that kind of points to how several of these mega projects in impoverished countries are quite literally falling apart, and foisting greater debt onto nations that are already struggling with their economic situation. Um, the one child policy is another one of these sorts of attempts to really quickly, rapidly slam the brakes on population growth. And the results have been really catastrophic for the country. You have a widespread gender imbalance. It's been really, we'll never know how many forced abortions and instances of infanticide it's resulted in. And there's a demographic aging crisis across the country that the CCP is struggling to cope with. So you have there's just this long history of these kind of top-down acceleration efforts that backfire tremendously.
And so the stakes are higher then with artificial intelligence, perhaps, or maybe they're just different. But it's one thing to have a population problem inside China that can have some consequences as their economy changes in shape and size. But with the development of artificial intelligence, and drawing from our conversation about Xinjiang in an environment where there isn't quality control, respect for human dignity, checks and balances, this is a completely new kind of threat, I would say. And this is the other part of the intro that I thought was really, really provocative in a positive way. And maybe we can draw it a bit more. Had this blurb that says, as the world settles into a new era of rivalry, this time between China and the United States, competition over another revolutionary technology, artificial intelligence, has sparked a flurry of military and ethical concerns parallel to those initiated by the nuclear race. Those concerns are well worth the attention they are receiving. And more, a world of autonomous weapons and machine speed war could have devastating consequences for humanity. Beijing's use of AI tools help fuel its crimes against humanity against the Uyghur people in Xinjiang already amounts to a catastrophe. So let's unpack a little bit of really quite a lot that's in that paragraph of your assertion that where we are with AI is analogous to where we were in the Cold War with regard to the nuclear threat. So let's unpack that a bit.
Well, it seems to be a increasingly understood fact that artificial intelligence will be kind of the pivotal technology in the decades ahead, including in geopolitics. So there are definite parallels to the nuclear race in that regard. There are also some important differences to state up front. One is that nuclear technology really had two applications: nuclear energy and nuclear weapons. Artificial intelligence is very multi-purpose, much more like electricity. So the ways in which it will revolutionize war, will revolutionize economies, and so on is much more diverse. But you see this kind of consensus emerging among tech industry leaders and geopolitical leaders that it will be pretty fundamental to competition in years ahead. Vladimir Putin noted that whoever has the advantage in AI will rule the world. We have similar statements from Xi Jinping, and there's a whole chorus of figures in open societies arguing as well that AI will be fundamental to power in the decades ahead.
Well, in this general field of application of technology by the government, how is the Chinese government's use of these technological tools evolved over time?
I'd say that it's an interesting thing when we talk about artificial intelligence in China and the government. You can actually see that the progress of artificial intelligence between open societies and China has really mirrored their kind of societal kind of predilections. So in open societies, we generally have the advantage on what's called generative AI. So these tools that can kind of create things, can create art, can create free expression, these sorts of questions. Where the Chinese excel is in surveillance technology and in image recognition, in voice recognition, in these sorts of tools where the government is especially interested in cashing in on the AI, excuse me, revolution. Um, so I would say I think that it's been a slow progress over several years, where the United States has really been leading the innovation in artificial intelligence, um, but has had several important research centers in China that have incubated an AI ecosystem within the PRC that matured over several years, and then when China took kind of its autocratic turn under Xi Jinping, the tech went with it. And that's really when things started taking off in terms of a lot of these technologies being let loose throughout China and increasingly around the world.
We have some long-standing trends with U.S.-China relations, economic relations, tech transfer. One thesis that is out there with which I might have some sympathy is that America and the West has done a great deal to train, equip, and enable the Chinese government in some of these fields, and sort of the non-government sector, which is kind of hard to measure and gauge in China. Where are these spaces that are beyond the reach of the Chinese government? Hard to verify, but we've had ties of academic institutions, research grants, the research that resulted in COVID is one of those areas where people have started to sort of pull the thread and say, are we wise to engage in collaboration and risky research with partners that don't have the same ecosystem of ethics and checks and balances and quality control? And any of the questions in medical research could be echoed 1,000 times on tech. In your research, are there any particular takeaways or trends with regard to the American private sector, government sector, cultural areas where we're actually enabling and fueling this, and then it turns around being used for things that most Americans would object to or could be used to hurt us?
Yeah, I think you've really hit the nail on the head there. Um, in a lot of ways, the technological repression ecosystem that's coming out of China, um, we laid the foundation for, unwittingly, with the best of intentions. But ultimately, when you look at things like Microsoft's AI research lab in Beijing and the alumni of that program, it reads as a who's who of the big AI tech companies in China today that are fueling the repression in Xinjiang and elsewhere. Um, it's I might even say, in zooming out a little bit, we had this idea that by kind of opening up Chinese economics and engaging with free trade with China, we might kind of pull them in the direction of a freer, more open society. And in recent years, we've seen that conclusion kind of turned on its head. I would say you could argue that trend is most dramatic in tech, where it's not that we've pulled them into a freer, more open internet, but quite the reverse, that they've pulled the internet and these technologies further into kind of autocratic, repressive applications.
Well, that is a chilling observation and thesis, but I think one that we have to face just square on. And but when we think of these things, we tend to think of what the Chinese government could do to harm U.S.-China relations or U.S. commercial interests, or mess around with ordinary American lives. People think about TikTok and other kinds of things creeping in with algorithmic surveillance or what have you. But in your writings, you've talked a little bit about this concept of an AI catastrophe. You say that China is flirting with an AI catastrophe? So can you define that a little bit more about, is this something that would be inherently bad for China, or are they flirting with an AI catastrophe as in an AI version of Chernobyl that, yes, it affects them, but there's a lot of fallout for everybody else?
Yeah, so I think both are likely. I am maybe more worried selfishly about the latter. But I would say a catastrophe is any event, kind of discrete event that causes large loss of human life or of economic potential or so on. So an AI catastrophe is any kind of use of artificial intelligence that suddenly leads to a major issue that has horrible consequences. So a few possibilities that already have proof of concept. In 2010, there was what's known as the flash crash, where there were algorithms that were playing off each other in the stock market that wiped out more than $1 trillion of value nearly instantaneously. That is kind of a mini catastrophe. It ended up being kind of fixable, but the next one may not be. Another example, and maybe the most chilling, is there was an American pharmaceutical company that had an AI-powered system to minimize for toxicity as they're developing drugs, and they flipped the purpose of the machine just kind of as a demo to see what would happen. So instead of minimizing toxicity, they set the system to maximize. And what they found is within 6 hours, this system designed 40,000 potential biochemical weapons. Um,
Oh,
some of those may not work. Some of them may not actually really be able to materialize, but some of them are known chemical weapons. And some of them are in this in between area where they really might just be novel biochemical weapons that we didn't know about before, but that were discovered by the system with really shocking ease and in an incredibly short amount of time. So you can see from those sorts of illustrations how this really powerful technology can suddenly and easily and sometimes accidentally go really off the rails with with devastating consequences. I think.
well,
Oh, go ahead.
well, I think just to get our novice heads around what an AI catastrophe really would entail, making it into sort of like a movie. For instance, I mean, when people think of a nuclear disaster, they think of an explosion, a mushroom cloud, a nuclear reactor meltdown. It's something that's physical, it's tangible, it's observable. What is it about AI that would generate this kind of a catastrophe, and how would it do it? Because I think one of the challenges about AI for the mass population is even understanding what is this and how is it a factor in doing these things? Is it taking down our power grid? Is it something that is just manipulating our communication systems? Is it something that is actually effectively stealing identities and wiping out people's ability to sustain themselves? Is it something that's undermining our food supply? And maybe it's all the above. But what is this AI? and how does it do this awful Dr. Strangelove stuff?
Sure. Well, I think it is all of the above. The difficulty with it is that it applies to quite a lot of domains
Yeah.
in quite different ways. So again, it as a general use technology, you can build AI into systems to really get huge gains in efficiency, in complexity, in sophistication, but also new vulnerabilities. So I guess if you want a working definition of AI, it's a set of tools um, to allow machine systems to learn, and often to learn things beyond what humans are capable of. Um, so let's say, what does a catastrophe look like? You can almost say, what does a catastrophe look like in any particular domain? And then you apply artificial intelligence to it, and it can often make that domain kind of the advantages and the risks of it more acute, just because it can turbocharge that domain. Um, so in the same way we might worry about critical infrastructure hacks taking out our water or our electricity or um, these sort of critical systems, you could imagine a AI kind of turbocharged cybersecurity hack towards critical systems, uh, doing that in kind of a more devastating or more dynamic way. You turn to nuclear reactors, and obviously it's not the AI that's exploding, right? But in the same way that we've used computer viruses to kind of derail um, nuclear reactors in Iran, you could imagine that a next generation of computer viruses integrates AI, and could lead to similar effects. So I think that you've articulated the challenge well, which is that it's not a substance, it's not a one system, it's not touching one particular sort of catastrophe, but it's an accelerant. It's an accelerant in a lot of domains, and kind of necessarily an accelerant in a lot of possible disasters.
Yeah. Well, for my simple mind, and maybe it just comes from my own point of view to try to get my head around it, when I try to think about what the danger of artificial intelligence is, that one of the things that makes it artificial is that it takes a human out of the equation. And while humans are filled with flaws, they also have a soul. And so even if they are set on a particular direction, there is at least a chance that at some point their soul will give them a pang and make them question what they are doing and maybe change course, and thus civilization can avoid calamity. And if you take that kind of variable out of the equation, what you have is speed without ethics, without a soul. It should be fairly clear why that is dangerous. And if you marry that together with the biggest, most advanced, most ruthless government ever known to mankind, then we have a government without ethics and without a soul, with technology that is extremely far reaching, very fast, and very powerful, also without ethics. So to me, that in layman's terms is how this becomes a challenge in terms of the technology. I think one of the reasons why Elon Musk has spoken so many times about the need to create some kind of self-regulating mechanisms in the development and deployment of artificial intelligence. I'm not smart enough to understand what those are or how they might work, but I think I can understand where that concern is coming from. But then you overlay that with China under Xi Jinping and under the Communist Party of China today, and I think it should be a big alarm sound going off. It raises a lot of questions, though, about what we do in terms of policy. There's been talk in recent times about notions of strategic decoupling. There's people who use a different preferred term of de-risking. There's lots of talk about supply chains. And the one area that seems to be a bipartisan consensus in the United States anyway, and with several of our allies, but not all, is that in the most sensitive areas of technology, we shouldn't be investing into China to develop these kinds of capabilities, and we shouldn't be dependent upon China for critical inputs in these kinds of sensitive areas. What have been some of the things you've observed in terms of the realities of those interplays, the supply chains, or what have you? And then what's your take on this policy argument about, okay, we've got the diagnosis. Bill's done a great job of scaring us to death. Now, what do we do in terms of putting policies in place that accept those lessons, but live in the real world of fast moving trade? And what was high technology 5 years ago is not high technology anymore, but it still could be dangerous.
Sure. Well, I think you gave a really great characterization of the way things are moving, and broadly, I very much agree with that direction. So particularly in AI, um, the United States government has restricted the export of the most advanced AI specific chips to China, um, which really helps to slow down their advancement in these technologies because, as you say, we read the writing on the wall, and we know if they have unfettered access to these cutting edge capabilities, the results are going to be nasty. Um, and so I applaud this administration's efforts to curb that eventuality, to curb that risk. And in general, the move away from equipping China with advanced technologies, I think, is a positive move. As you say, it's a very delicate art. Our economies are still very interwoven. Um, I think at the end of the day, our adversary is not the Chinese people; it's the Chinese Communist Party. So we also need to balance this with trying to find ways to empower the people, and also to technologically empower them to get around the Great Firewall, to avoid these sorts of new autocratic technologies that the state is building out. But I think it's going to be painful one way or another, both for our bottom lines and for um, a lot of the kind of economic ecosystem that exists in China today.
Well, you make an important point that we make in nearly every episode at the China Desk, that the Communist Party of China is evil and is the enemy of the Chinese people from our point of view. And it is a strategic threat to the American way of life and a lot of what the Western world has invested in terms of peace, prosperity, and a sense of order in the world. And the Chinese people are separate from that. In fact, it's sad that with the manipulation of Chinese history, that experts in China, but sadly even out in the Western world, conflate the People's Republic of China with the long swath of thousands of years of Chinese civilization and history, seemingly forgetting that it was the Communist Party of China that split China in a civil war and engaged in a revolution against all of those things that were historical and affected everything from language to the family, institutions of religion, all these things that had been there for thousands of years, with sad, sad consequence. So it's an important point, and I appreciate you making that in the course of this conversation too. But as we look at this challenge of supply chains, trade patterns. We had the G7 talking about the some senses of unity around dealing with China, color me skeptical about whether there really is unity about this, because I see a lot of tension between where France, Germany, and others are with regard to Russia and also with regard to where they are on China. So it's very much a work in progress in terms of where we are with allies on this. But I know you've invested a fair amount of your career in looking at the Indo-Pacific. But as you look at the Indo-Pacific, or more broadly, zoom out from U.S.-China, what do you see the conversation being among neighbors, friends, and allies? Is it tracking with what we have discussed and what we're experiencing in America? Or is it different, as I might have suggested, with some of our partners versus others?
I think you're right that it's different. I think in aggregate, it's still headed in the right direction, maybe just not as quickly as I would like. So we see that public perceptions of China have been plummeting in recent years among Europeans and among other Asian nations. Uh, the governments have not always caught up to that change in perception. And you can see places, especially Germany, for example, still growing in their economic dependency on China, which, in light of Ukraine, you would think that there might be sort of this awakening of conscience about the dangers of autocratic regimes, and it doesn't seem to be materializing as much as we might like. Uh, but I think at the end of the day, China's uh, kind of posturing on the global stage is doing quite well at alienating the rest of the world. Um, so, like I say, I think there's still a long way to go. I think one of the major problems is that the way we are taught history really underemphasizes how big a problem the CCP has been uh, continually. And uh, I mean, if when people think of the early 20th century, they think about Hitler and Stalin as these kind of evil paragons, which is fair, but they usually leave out Mao, and he should absolutely be part of that triad. Um, Similarly, I think if you go to Tiananmen Square, we think of the 1989 massacre of students calling for democracy. I mean, any American that goes may be shocked to find that you don't find a lot of that memory among Chinese around you, but what you do find are long lines of people with flowers, sometimes crying, waiting to leave flowers at the grave, at the mausoleum of Mao Zedong, who, as we mentioned earlier in this conversation, uh, steered China into the greatest famine in human history, killing uh, approximately 33 million of his own compatriots. So there's a long way to go in terms of correcting the perceptions of China um, in the US, even, but certainly among our allies and friends.
Well, as we come up to a conclusion here shortly, I'd welcome some of your final thoughts on what all of this means for the United States, what this means for the American people, the challenges before our government, what the executive branch has to face and deal with, what our legislative branch has to face and deal with, what our leaders in states, industry, academia are dealing with. I mean, you have a very interesting and compelling issue set before you every day as you go to work with this look at AI, a new frontier fraught with peril, but also massive opportunities for humanity. And then the U.S.-China relationship that has been colored in an unpleasant way, I would argue, by Xi Jinping. I don't think the Communist Party of China has been a blessing to anyone at any point in its history, but Xi Jinping has been particularly damaging when it comes to the leaders of China in the modern era. But Bill, I just invite you to share a few of your observations or recommendations for what leaders in government, at the federal, state, or corporate and academic world should have in mind.
Well, I think it's a great question. I think we're in the middle of a society-wide discussion on where artificial intelligence and these emerging technologies will go, what their risks are, um, and how we should um, approach governing and building them out. And that's a conversation we need to have. I think if I have one message for everyone in that conversation, it's to recognize that we have underestimated the Chinese Communist Party in tech, in geopolitics, for too long and to our peril. And the same is true with AI. So, as we're trying to envision a world in which these technologies are safe, dependable, and really promote human flourishing, uh, yes, we absolutely need to get that right in our own societies. But we also need to recognize that what may be the largest threat to that future is the Chinese Communist Party. And figuring out how to get that right should really be at the top of the agenda.
Well, I think that's an excellent summary of a very interesting conversation that I've certainly benefited from. Bill, for anybody in the audience that wants to track you and your work and occasional musings and observations on policy in this area, where should the audience go to follow your fine thoughts?
Well, you can find me on Twitter at Bill_Drexel. You can also find my scholar page at the Center for a New American Security. That's CNAS.org. So I look forward to engaging with anyone and hearing everyone's thoughts. Thank you.
Very good. Well, if you enjoyed today's China Desk conversation, please tell your friends and consider subscribing on YouTube or on your preferred podcast platform. Thank you for joining, and a special thank you to Bill Drexel for sharing his perspective. Until next time, I'm Steve Yates, your host here at the China Desk.
Thank you for listening to the China Desk podcast, presented by the Federal Newswire and hosted by Steve Yates. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream.